All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay there. My name is Andrea, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator for Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, founded in 1833. Joining me today is my colleague Kylie, who will be helping. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd like to extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. And I'll just cover some housekeeping for you all for the Zoom meeting today. By default, your microphones have been muted. This is so we can avoid distractions like coughs, phones ringing, dogs barking, that sort of thing. So please keep your microphone on mute at all times. We will be recording today's talk. However, it will only record the speaker and the presentation. Participants in the audience will not be recorded. If you are currently in gallery view, which shows everyone logged into the meeting, you might want to click on the little symbol at the top right corner and change that to speaker view. That will ensure that you can see Stephen and his presentation without distraction. Now, if anyone is experiencing problems with computer audio, I will put the instructions in the chat on how you can use your phone to hear the audio instead. Lastly, when it's time for Q&A, I'll ask you to remain on mute and just send me your questions in the chat. And that way I can then moderate the discussion. So just introducing our speaker today. So we've got Stephen J. Pyne here. He's Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. He spent 15 seasons with the North Rim Longshots Fire Crew and 3 seasons writing fire plans for the National Park Service. He is author of the critically acclaimed Cycle of Fire books. A world expert on the history of fire, he has made many visits to Australia, which has informed his argument about the pyrocene. Please join me in welcoming Stephen. Thanks, Stephen, if you want to take over.
Okay. Can you hear me? Are we good?
Yep.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I hope you all have a good day. I'm here to talk about fire, give you a very brief survey of it and what I think the future looks like. And like many of us, I'm concerned about our environmental future. And I've been particularly struck by people who claim that that future is not only so dire, but so strange that we have no narrative by which to connect it to what has happened in the past, and we have no analog by which to understand it. And I hope that with my talk today, you'll see that we do have a narrative. It's a great narrative. It's the story of humanity and fire. And I think we do have an analog. That when you add up all of our combustion practices, we're really creating the fire equivalent of an ice age, or what I call the pyrocene. Well, let's begin with what the Pleistocene was like. About 3 million years ago, the Earth went into a general cooling trend. And then about 2.5 million years ago, depending on wobbles and twists and turns in the orbit, what are called Milankovitch cycles, it began going in and out of ice ages. So for about 2.6 million years, we've been in the Pleistocene. About 80% of it has been glacial, about 90% of the last million years. And you can see this graph on the bottom. The high points are the warm periods, and then below that, the cool periods. And you can see it coming and going in a kind of eccentric rhythm. And then we come to today's situation, and the warming is continuing and not returning back to the cold. There were a few interesting blurbs in the sort of bumps in the trend. A little ice age. We'll come to that a little later. So what was it like? Well, there were a lot of ice-informed landscapes, immense ice, continental scale. There were lots of periglacial phenomenon sort of associated with it, from lakes, outwash plains, permafrost. Let's see here, just a second. And of course, this is the time that the hominins appear. We are an ice age creation. And here we have our ancestors doing what they were supposed to do. They're bringing fuel to the fire. I'm sorry, I'm having a little, there we go. So the acquisition by hominins of fire was a major event in the planetary history of fire. In a sense, we got small guts and big heads because we learned to cook food. And then we went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes. Lots of hunting and foraging societies used fire very widely. And one of the consequences was to keep a more grassy, open environment, less prone to closed forests. And then we went, to a next stage, not simply the control over ignition, the ability to decide where and when to start a fire, but to begin manipulating fuels. And this, for a fire historian, is the meaning of agriculture. We begin cutting, drying, draining, loosing livestock, doing all kinds of things that makes more of the landscape available for burning. And some of this can be domesticated into a fire fallow of agriculture. The fallow was grown so you had something to burn, and then the fire did its ecological magic and helped prepare the land for crops. Agriculture of this sort was a very adept form of colonizing. Here we have Russian monks cutting, burning, and planting, moving into Eurasia, and of course Europeans carrying their fires and understanding of fire and plants and animals around the world to boot. Now, part of that expansion also resulted in demographic collapse. Perhaps as much as 90% of the Americas indigenous population died as a result of diseases and dislocation. Europe, prior to that, had been hit by the Black Death. So there was a collapse in human population, and this correlates roughly with the so-called Little Ice Age. And some interesting studies are underway to puzzle over whether the removal of people allowed forests and carbon to be stored enough to allow the ice to begin returning. That's yet to be decided. But it's interesting because we have throughout our history affected the world around us, and fire has been our primary environmental tool. We are the Earth's keystone species for fire. We have a species monopoly over it. Fire is what we do that no other creature does. And our environmental power in many ways is a fire power. But it always operated within what we might call living landscapes. So fire is in many ways a creation of the living world. Life created the oxygen, life created the fuels, rearranges it. So fire came within boundaries. It burned in certain seasons and not in others, certain times of the day and not in others. It burned when it was dry, not when it was wet. And if you exceeded those bounds, which you could for a while, then the system would crash and you would have to retire until it rebuilt. But humans, always interested in expanding their firepower, decided to turn to the geologic past, or what I've come to call lithic landscapes, that is fossil biomass. Once living landscapes that are now buried, we're exhuming them out of that ancient earth, burning it with all kinds of interesting and odd interactions in the present, and then releasing the effluent into the future. And this was an enormous acceleration in humanity's firepower. In effect, it became unbounded. What I think of as this Pyrrhic transition, one of the major shifts is that previously people had always looked for more stuff to burn. They were limited by the amount of sources available. But now the sources aren't limited in practical terms. And the problem is one of sinks, where to put all of the effluent. And this time we can burn day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry, it doesn't matter. So all of the old ecological baffles and barriers that had helped to check and balance humanity's firepower are gone. And we began remaking all of our habitats. Let's say our domestic world. You know, our houses used to be filled with working fires for lighting, cooking, heating. Now, when we've converted to a fossil fuel economy, we don't see the fires. The fires occur off-site. All we see is the light. Or we might even replace the fireplace altogether with a virtual fire shown on a computer monitor. Urban fires changed. You know, cities used to be made of the same materials as the surrounding countryside, and they burned as often. The same winds, droughts, fuel arrangements drove fires. Now, fires are rare. It takes a war. It takes major civil unrest. It takes an earthquake to break down the conditions that allow modern industrial cities to burn. In a sense, all of the materials here have already passed through the flames to make glass, metal, and concrete. And agriculture. All the fumigating and fertilizing effect of fire, the whole cycle of fallowing and burning that was integral to fire outside of, at least outside of floodplains, is now being remade in the same way. So we get our chemicals, our pesticides, our fertilizers, our herbicides, mostly by processing fossil biomass. And now we deliver it with internal combustion engines. So we're changing even our agriculture. Stubble used to be burned frequently. Now increasingly it is being restricted. Less and less agricultural burning. And this is occurring throughout the world, wherever societies began making the conversion to fossil fuels. And in wildlands, certainly I'll give you some examples from the United States, the late 19th century, particularly driven by railroads, a new power source, reorganizing the landscape. The United States at that period was a lot like Brazil today. Huge fires, damaging fire, mega fires, an order of magnitude larger and more lethal than what we've seen in recent decades. Well, this was a global phenomenon. Australia had some of the same, felt some of the same consequences, and it gave rise to a global program of state-sponsored conservation. And one of the core ingredients of this was to set aside reserves that would be taken outside this kind of economy. And they were, perhaps by accident, given to foresters. And forestry then became the oracle and engineer of free burning fire, whether it was in Australia or North America or in India. In fact, British India was where a lot of these ideas were first worked out. Forestry really didn't understand fire. Central Europe, where forestry was developed, thought of it as just a form of agriculture. They thought of fire as simply a problem of human misbehavior. Our first forester in the United States dismissed the whole question as one of bad habits and loose morals. There was no sense that fire had a place in landscape, and really there was no science of fire, of landscape fire, to bring to bear. So if any of you are fans of Kipling, you might have wondered what happens to Mowgli after he grows up. Well, Kipling wrote a story that explains, and what happens is that Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Department, and he becomes a fire guard, a protector of the forest. And I love that because it shows the range of thinking in this regard. So Australia's foresters, interestingly enough, after World War II, were the one group of foresters globally to rebel against this project. Maybe we can talk about that later. But the same tendency is now extended into wildlands. Here is how you protected yourself against fire in the past. You lit other fires. These are burning out operations. Since they can't move the encampment, they're trying to surround it with a protective layer. But you would burn very widely, systematically, but usually in patches generally. And that was how you protected yourself. But after you industrialize, we have other methods. We try to create a counterfire from our industrial machines. So suppose we took away the air tankers and helicopters. We took away the bulldozers and graders. We took away the engines. We took away the chainsaws and pumps. We took away the trucks to carry crews. What kind of firefighting could we have? we would have to go back to the way people had historically managed fire, which is to say to substitute their fire and to organize the landscape in such a way that they would not be threatened by very large fires. So this kind of industrial transition has sort of rolled across area and area of human life and habitat. And I'll point out that all of this happens even in the absence of anthropogenic climate change. This is simply a result of people changing how they use fire on the land. Okay, I'll promise not too many graphs. This is a familiar one. It actually ends 20 years ago, so the curve could be much higher than this, but it shows energy sources. And the higher part there are all the fossil fuels. But note the periods. And now let's abstract this period from the United States, where we have some records of landscape burning. And this is not agriculture, this is just on protected lands. And you can see that very quickly, but systematically, from various sources, the fires are removed. This is the same transition we see in cities and houses, and increasingly see in agriculture. Living landscape fires decline, and the lithic landscape burning increases. Okay. And now to this, let's add climate change as a performance enhancer and a globalizer. So all these other changes depend on particular areas. You're in one realm or the other of combustion. But through the atmosphere, we're all subject to whatever anybody else does. So a very quick survey of fire history. For most of Earth history, fire was natural. We have a record of fire of charcoal dating back 420 million years. So essentially, as soon as plants colonized continents, they began to burn, and they've been burning ever since. But it depends on lots of things. It has to have the right cycle of wetting and drying. It has to have the right kind of ignition. So fire is patchy. Some places burn a lot, some don't. Some places burn frequently, some places burn rarely. But fire is a continual feature of the Earth. In fact, the Earth is the only fire planet we know of. And then humans come on the scene. They capture fire. They begin changing the patterns of ignition. They change the arrangement of fuels in various ways, directly and indirectly. And so all the old patches are rearranged. They're recoded. The timing is different. And lightning or wildfire can take whatever isn't managed, whatever isn't previously burned or in some pattern. And then we come to the industrial fire era, and you can see I'm no graphic artist. But what I'm trying to indicate here is that we now have a third dimension. It's not just on the surface. We're taking stuff out of the past, burning it on the surface, and then releasing it into the future. And one of the things that gets lost in this is the old tradition of humans systematically burning the landscape. And instead, we see a revival of lightning fire. We see a revival of feral fire, if you will. So it's a very odd era. You've probably seen images of Earth at night. Let me suggest one that doesn't show just the electric lights, but also the fires. So here, south of the Sahara, lots and lots of burning going on, but it's all in living landscapes. There are some bright lights offshore. Well, those are oil. Those are gas flares from oil drills. There are some lights, city lights around Johannesburg and Cape Town, but essentially you're one or the other, and it's dominated by living landscapes. If you look at Europe, it's dominated by other sources of energy. Very little burning of the landscape. Now, not all those lights are the result of fossil fuel combustion. There's nuclear, there's hydro. Increasingly, there are some other renewables, but generally this is a fossil fuel created lightscape. And what isn't burning directly uses fire in its various technologies to make the others possible. And what gets lost between this is that middle realm that we tend to go when you develop, as development is understood, we tend to remove that middle realm out. Interesting illustration, North Korea, conspicuous in these satellite and space station images by its darkness. But if you look at the daytime heat signatures, MODIS image, they are almost all contained within the political entity called North Korea. It's an extreme example because there's no other difference on the peninsula in ethnic history except for a war in 1950, and that resulted in a division in which one country developed one way and the other didn't, and they have totally different fire signatures accordingly. So megafires have now joined our forlorn polar bear as an emblem of climate change and a strange and threatening future to come. But I would argue that it's more than climate change. It's certainly there. It's the whole suite of impacts created by a fossil fuel civilization, how we get our energy sources, how we organize our land, how we do agriculture, how we put our houses, how we structure our cities, all kinds of ecological pathologies and the rest that may result from this. And a great example, I think, of where these two realms collide is with power line fires. Here, a line carrying the energy from one source, burning fossil fuels, kindles fires in the living landscape with often disastrous results. And talk about novel ecosystems, we're going to see a lot more as the future matures. So to give a little Australian frame to it, here is the first great recorded bushfire in Australian colonial history, Black Thursday Fire by William Strutt. And this is a triptych from the Malakuta fires of last season. And it's interesting to note some of the differences. So instead of horses and livestock carrying, we have cars powered by petrol. Instead of people fleeing, in a sense, the flames, we have them huddling on the shores waiting to be evacuated by ship. And instead of materials left to the side, materials of natural sources, leather, cloth, wool, wood, we have plastics and synthetics. So it makes an interesting contrast. This is where we're going. We had a fire crisis before climate change even became recognized. In the United States in the 1960s and 70s, we sought the American fire community sought as its primary task to restore fire, to put fire back. We'd spent 50 years trying to take it out, and we've since spent 50 years trying to get some good fire back in. All this before climate change became recognized. Now, adding in climate change, a fire crisis is morphing into a fire epoch. So let's go back into our Pleistocene model and see what has changed. Pyrocene, primary driver fossil fuel combustion, not just in the atmosphere, but generally. How about fire-informed biotas? Less and less ice on the planet. It's in retreat. Almost all the relics of the Pleistocene, creatures, ices, in ground, in remote settings are being driven away. They're replaced by fire-informed biotas. Not that they burn day and night, year after year, but that they are shaped, increasingly sculpted by fire in one of its forms. What about all those sort of ancillary facts, like the outwashed plains of sand and loess? Well, how about smoke balls, mega smoke balls, distributing the effects of the fires far and wide? Rise in sea level, mass extinctions. It's mapping pretty well. And what about our hominins? A nice image. This is from Fort McMurray, Canada, a few years ago. Fort McMurray is a very modern city in northern Alberta. It was set up to mine tar sands, which is a very dirty fossil fuel. And here is a fire boiling out of the boreal forest, the living landscape burning into and threatening that community. Another form where we're colliding. And in this case, instead of having hominins bringing fuel to the fire, they're using their fuel to flee the fires that the way they live on the land has created. Add it all together, and I think we're headed for a fire age, what I call the Pyrocene. And places like Australia, California, and many other spots that are already fire prone are going to find themselves on the leading edge. So what of the future? Well, I'd sum up our present condition as too much bad fire, too little good fire, and way too much combustion overall. And the task is how to get that back in balance. Well, I'm not a scientist. I actually come out of the humanities. I'm a historian. I'm trained in literature and other fields, even a little art history and so forth. So I deal with narratives. And I think we have two narratives before us to choose from. And one is the Promethean story. And it's a story of fire as power, of fire abstracted from its natural setting, perhaps by violence, certainly by stealth, and then applied to enhance the power of those who receive it. And I think we have way too much Promethean fire. The other narrative is a very different one. It tells of fire as a companion on our journey, as something we have always had with us, that we can't imagine ourselves without, something that we use to enhance the habitability of the surroundings, and in fact, in a way, are stewards for all of the living landscape. And we have way too little of this. So in addition to how different places and different societies are going to work through those narratives is, I think, the story of our time and the kind of world we leave to our children and grandchildren. But however we go, I suggest we recall the words of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declaimed, "They shall go out from one fire, and another fire shall devour them." We will always find ourselves between fires. And I think that's one of the definitions of what it means to be human. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Stephen. We do have time for some questions. If anyone wanted to just post any questions that you have into the chat, which you can find if you just hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to click on the chat functionality, and then on the right hand side it will pop up hopefully for you. So if you've got any questions for us, please do let us know. We've got a few minutes. We have run over time obviously because of our technical issues, but thank you, Stephen, for going through that quite quickly. And Kylie also is about to upload some links so that you can find Stephen's books easily. So we're just going to post that to the chat very shortly so that you can link through to that, and also to Stephen's author webpage.
Question, could you please elaborate on the difference between fire as a power and fire as a partner?
Okay, we just had a question come through, and it was...
Can you elaborate
on the difference between
fire as a power,
and fire as a partner?
Oh, great.
Power and partner. Did you get that? Sorry, I was just getting Kylie to give me that one because I didn't have access to it.
No, that's a great one, and thank you. I hadn't discovered that alliteration before. I will be sure to save that up. Well, I think all fire is a power, but a partnership is also a relationship. And we have tended to make fire, taken it out of its biological setting, made it into a machine, made it into a mechanical source of energy. And at that point, it is unbounded. Some of that I'm okay with. You know, I'm happy to have a house with electricity and not have flames running through my cities. But we can find other sources than combustion to do that. The partnership, again, it goes back to fire as a relationship. We think of fire as a tool. It keeps being defined by all the people who use it as, most people use it as a tool, and hence it's a device that's completely subjected to our whims and talents. In fact, it is a bonding. We made a mutual assistance pact with fire long ago, before we were a distinct species. And we have expanded the range of fire hugely, and fire has taken us everywhere. It's even taken us off planet. So, but what had been a mutual assistance pact, in effect a kind of partnership, has now become more Promethean power relationship, and I think it's looking more and more like a Faustian bargain. And we need, fire is not simply ours to use. It's not simply a mechanical tool. It's also a biotechnology. And there are, when we use fire in landscapes, it acts as a kind of broad spectrum ecological catalyst. And it does lots of things that our reductionist approach is not capturing, and we are losing. And that's the sense of relationship or partnership I would emphasize.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. We've got another really interesting question coming through now, and it is, how much faith do you have in Indigenous firefighting practices in Australia, such as things like mosaic burning, etc.? Do you know much about those, and how much faith do you have in those?
Well, I have, they've certainly succeeded. The question is adapting them to present conditions. And I think that there is a lot we can learn in the United States as well. And it isn't just that the colonial era squashed indigenous knowledge and indigenous fire practices. European elites reacted the same way towards their peasants. They hated fire in agriculture and pastoralists and dismissed it. So we lost a lot of empirical knowledge. Now we're trying to put it back. The way we're trying to put it back with these kinds of set piece prescribed fires, where we are completely in control of it, or at least nominally in control, are not working at scale. We're simply not able to get it done fast enough on a big enough scale. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from past indigenous practices. How did these people do it for hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of years? They didn't do it the way we're doing it. So there may be lots of ways we can modify it and adapt it, but I think we need to learn from that. The other thing I think we can learn is the sense that fire works when it's part of a culture. And if it's just a tool, it's not culturally embedded, it's not going to work. And no matter how good your technology and science are, you're not going to get the right kind of fire in the right places at the right amount. If you have a culture, you will, with or without the science. So we've got to accept a bit of humility here and say that people managed to do it much better than we're doing. How? How can we adapt that, modify it, work as a partnership, if you will, so that fire, that we have certain responsibilities for fire, not simply the power that fire can bestow.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great. So we've got one more question that I'm going to ask, just because we are sort of going over time. And after that, Kylie's going to post some links to the chat so that everyone can access those. So we've got a question here. Layla is asking, she would be interested to know more about the India example you mentioned in the talk, Stephen, if there's time to just elaborate on that briefly.
Sure. Well, when the British experience in India was really the foundation for the modern forestry programs for fire protection around the world. The British were appalled by the amount of burning in India, saw it as a social unrest, needed to rationalize it like they did everything else, or sought to do everything else in India. They didn't have forestry, so they brought in some Germans. Germans were a remarkable group who didn't like fire and sought to remove it. And there was an experiment in the 1860s where they were actually able for a couple of years to keep fire out of a place, and they took that to show that it would work. Of course, they forget that the next year it all burned and failed, but they were determined that they could. And the British model, the Indian model was where all the cadets in the British Imperial Forestry System trained and then were distributed around the world. And they took that, and it turned out not to work. They had to make compromises. They wouldn't admit it publicly, but they had to increasingly accommodate local burning. They were having to, what they called early burning. They would burn early in the season as much as they could to protect the forest reserves. Then they found themselves burning along trails and other places within the reserves. So in the end, they probably burned as much as would have anyway, but they did it nominally under their control, with the understanding that ultimately they could eliminate fire. And it was just a misguided attempt from start to finish. But they were very committed to it. Eventually they had to make, and for one of the great examples, Burma actually split off from the Indian Forest Service because they were unable to control fire, and it was just a constant insurgency by the locals, and the Brits recognized that what they wanted out of those forests was teak. The locals and their burning got teak. The British and their fire protection didn't. So they gave up and they decided they wanted teak more than they wanted to save face. So they withdrew. It's the only place I can think of. The British example in India is actually a very deep one because that got to Australia, it got to Africa, it got to North America. It was all over.
Okay, so Stephen,
the longer answer
no, that's fine. The questions are flowing through, so if you don't mind, we'll just ask a couple more while we have you. That's great. So the next one that I've got here, I'm just looking at this one here. So the question is, if I understood correctly from your talk, you mentioned that Europeans spread the specific use of fire for agriculture to different parts of the world, but what is your view on the evidence for the use of fire in food production in Australia before the arrival of the Europeans?
Well, I think, people were living for tens of thousands of years, so they were out and they did a lot of burning, so obviously they had a system that worked. You don't need agriculture in the European model to thrive. In fact, Europe had a very narrow model. You had to have specific plots of land owned. You had to use plows, et cetera, and that's not how agriculture works in much of the world. Slash and burn agriculture of Sweden is a very effective form of farming if you operate within the boundaries of it. From all the evidence I can find from reading, Australia's indigenous peoples were very successful at hunting, maintaining hunting habitats, foraging, using fire even with fishing along shores, using it at night in boats. They were very effective. They used it in a different way that Europeans didn't recognize, but Europeans didn't like fire in European agriculture. And the elites really were hostile towards it, that it was a stigma of primitivism. And so Australia's rural population was condemned in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we've got another question here from Nicholas. Could you comment on the control of our landscapes and agriculture using fire compared to pesticides? The widespread use of pesticides in agriculture is becoming increasingly recognised as one of the primary drivers in global extinctions. Could we go back to using fire as a tool to shape our agriculture again?
Well, I think there is certainly a place for fire. But probably fire in combination with other techniques, modern techniques. We need greater production than fire alone could probably give us for our need. But certainly we don't need to find complete substitutes for fire, or trying to, because we do the same thing that's happening with the effluent of industrial combustion. It's overloading the sinks, there's no place to go. Now we're overloading it with all of our chemicals. There's certainly a place for it, but part of the problem is that you have to have fuel for the fire. which means that you fallow. Or if you're in pastoralism, you put the land aside for a period of time so that you have stuff for the fire to burn. So part of the cost of using a fire is that you are going to decrease the kind of productivity we're used to. You might enhance the overall sustainability of the land and health of the land, but there are going to be some trade-offs.
Great, thank you. We've just got a couple more questions. So Louise has said, firstly, she said, fabulously informative talk. We've had a few thank yous along the way. She's also said, how effective do you think predictive modelling is in future fire control?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't do the modeling, and I'm a little wary of it. I see that so many models for their empirical evidence are running simulations. Well, the simulations are based on other models. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I just think that we should not be too puffed up with all of our computer graphics and go back to what nature can tell us. I think the near future is going to look like the near past. We're going to see more of the same. It's going to intensify. Further down the road, I don't know that we can model all the biological effects. We can make sense of a lot of the climate stuff. That's a physical problem. We start putting in the biology, that's enormously complicated. And then we start adding people. We start adding the anthropology, the politics, the sociology, the rest of it. I think it would be very difficult to predict the future. We can say if nothing else changes, we can project the same trends, but things are going to change. In saying that, I don't make an argument to be complacent. On the contrary, I think we face really desperate times. And I'm a fire guy. I mean, I'm a pyromantic, not a pyromaniac. I like fire. I want to build a case for fire, but we have allowed feral fire to take over places, and that's alarming. I don't have that much confidence, but I don't need those models to tell me we need to act. There's plenty of evidence around us.
Yeah. Okay, and we've got one more question here from Daryl. He's asking, what is the significance of the Black Saturday mega firestorm in Victoria a few years back, and then the Black Summer fires of 2020 in your framing of the pyrocene?
A great question. Hi, Daryl. I think I looked at that from an Australian perspective, and I think there was a kind of inflection point with those two fires, that the future is going to be triangulated from those 2 points. Black Saturday, probably the most savage single event or cluster of events that Australia has recorded, certainly for a long time. And the Black Summer or Red Summer fires, new standards for how long a fire season and severe a fire season can run. So those two events, I think, are geodetic markers in a sense from which we can lay down to look at the future. I just see them as an intensifying of the pyrocene. I think the pyrocene has been around for a long time, since the last ice age, but it was not a planetary disturbance in the way it has become. That is much more recent. So yeah, I think we can. Australia has big fires. It has long fire seasons. There may be a case that it has less fire in a larger sense because of other changes that have gone on, but it's certainly having more dangerous and damaging fires more frequently.
Yeah, it certainly is. Thank you, Stephen. We haven't got any more questions at the moment, so we might wrap up here. But thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. And we've posted to the chat here some links to your most recent books earlier in the chat there. And also we've got a link to other Science Week events that are happening in Sydney. And finally, just a bit of information about the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts in case you wanted to join as a member or find out some more about upcoming events. So thank you once again, Stephen.